Hi, this is John Rummel from the Madison Astronomical Society, and the title of this presentation is Astrophotography Without a Telescope. Astrophotography without a telescope. Yes, it is possible, and yes, you can do it and get some incredibly nice results. Astrophotography with a telescope is also a thing, and that's how people get beautiful pictures with close-ups of craters on the moon, planets like Jupiter and Saturn, or distant galaxies. But that type of astrophotography can be very expensive and very challenging to get into. Astrophotography without a telescope is something that you could probably do tonight with the camera that you already own, and I'm going to show you how. This is a picture that I took while camping in California several years ago. This was taken with my camera on a tripod, nothing fancy, no special equipment. The lens that I would use if I was shooting a picture of the Grand Canyon or a tall redwood tree or something like that. Off-the-shelf lens. This picture was taken at night, though, with a long exposure, capturing a starry sky spread above my campsite. Now, this was a 24-second exposure, something that your camera can probably do, but you need to know how to adjust the settings. You can do this. When you think about cameras today, a lot of people think about the cameras on their phones. Almost everybody carries a phone around with them, and a lot of these phones have very sophisticated cameras. In particular, the recent Google Pixel line and the recent iPhone cameras are incredibly sophisticated with their ability to do nighttime low light photography, much better than the earlier Google, Android, or Apple phones were able to do. Now, I do not have a Google Pixel 5 or an iPhone 11. I have a Canon SLR. Now, this is a pretty good Canon camera. I also have a Canon 7D in addition to this 80D, but almost any digital camera you have that was made in the last few years will probably work. You also need a tripod because we're talking about exposures that are longer than the typical 1/100th of a second exposure that you take during daytime. You have to keep the camera perfectly still, and a tripod is the best way to do that for multi-second exposures. Let's talk a little bit about the settings that you need to use. You need to have a wide angle lens. Wide angle is just a fancy way of saying that it's not a zoom lens. Most people use their camera in wide angle most of the time. That's what your phone camera does. It allows you to take a picture of something big, like a landscape or a big building or the Grand Canyon or something like that. Camera lenses are measured by their focal length. Focal length is a way of describing how much the camera or the lens is magnifying the view. Lower focal length numbers mean the wider the field of view. So 35 millimeters is a good starting point. If your focal length is 35 millimeters or lower, then your lens is wide enough to do this kind of photography. If it's higher than 35 millimeters, especially if it's too high, like 100, 150, or 200, then that's really designed for taking pictures of things that you want to magnify, like maybe a basketball game, your kid playing soccer, or that bird sitting in the tree 100 feet away. You want your lens to be wide, 35 millimeters or below. You also want to be able to do long exposures. So you're going to need to adjust the settings of your camera so that you can take exposures longer than a few seconds. Most cameras will make this relatively easy to do. You're going to need to control the aperture. The aperture is how wide the opening is in the lens that is permitting light to come into the camera. The larger the aperture, the smaller the f number. F 4.5 is about the starting point that you're going to want. So aperture numbers of f 4.5 or lower will be allowing the maximum light in, which will really help you in those low light nighttime situations. The final setting that I'll talk about is the camera's ISO. This is its sensitivity to light. Higher ISO numbers are more sensitive. I recommend setting your camera for ISO numbers of 1600 or higher. At high ISO settings, some pictures will start to look grainy or noisy, and that is normal. Depending upon the camera that you're using, that may be a really big factor or it may not be a big factor at all. Some of the newer cameras especially do a great job of controlling that grainy, noisy look at higher ISO levels. Older cameras may be a little noisier at those levels. Finally, you're going to need to find a dark location. City lights are not going to be your friend while you're trying to take pictures at long exposures of the nighttime sky. For instance, I stepped outside of my house in West Madison and shot this picture of Venus last, maybe the end of the winter, the early springtime. And Venus shows up very well there in the center of the picture, but those trees are brightly lit too. And that's because my house is located in an area where there are a lot of street lights and house lights and strip mall lights and cars driving by, all kinds of artificial lights that are lighting things up. This was an exposure of just a couple of seconds. Got Venus, but I didn't get very many stars. There are some faint stars in this photo, but they're really tough to see. You have to get to a dark location. This was taken down at Lake Geneva, Yerkes Observatory, several years ago during a star party. And you can see in this 15 to 20 second exposure, people standing on the lawn with their telescopes. Most of them have lights, either white lights or red lights. You can see lights coming from within the observatory building itself, and you can see some light pollution glow on the horizon. Lake Geneva is a lot darker than Madison, but it's still not really, really dark. But the thing I love about this picture is that it's dark enough to get a beautiful sky spread with stars above. This again was about a 15 to 20 second exposure with one of my Canon cameras on the tripod. You can do this. Now, some people might think with all those people with flashlights, you would want to go away, get away from that. But no, lights like that, foreground activity like that, can make for a more interesting shot. So this isn't just a shot of the sky. This is a shot of a star party, people looking at the sky with telescopes. I love this shot. This was taken at the MAS's, the Madison Astronomical Society's observatory, a couple of years ago. These two guys were looking through their telescope, and I asked them to pose for me. And that involved standing as still as they could for the 15 to 20 seconds of this shot. I didn't have a tripod. I propped my camera on my sweater on a picnic table, aimed it at them, and opened the shutter for about the 15 to 20 seconds while they stood still. I like this shot. Devil's Lake State Park a couple of years ago. Again, about a 15 to 20 second exposure. You can see the light pollution there, but you can also see a nice starry sky. A friend's house out by Arena, same thing. Camera on a tripod, dark skies, a little bit of light pollution visible, but that's not a problem. The clouds visible in this shot actually, I think, add some interest. This was a location in Montana a couple years ago. This is one of the darkest locations that I've ever been to. No light pollution at all, but there's a quarter moon in the sky. The moon is off to the right in this picture, but that moon, with this 15 to 20 second exposure, is enough to illuminate the foreground and illuminate those clouds. Beautiful shot. A lone camper down there in his camper van. I love shots like this. Same location, facing a different direction, still some clouds in the sky, still the moon lighting up the landscape, and you can see the Andromeda Galaxy there in the sky too. So you can capture images of some deep sky objects like galaxies, provided they're the Andromeda Galaxy and they're big enough to see with the naked eye. The Andromeda Galaxy is actually visible without a camera in a long exposure. It looks like a very faint fuzzy spot if you know where to look, but the camera in a long exposure can capture it easily. Another camping trip in Northern California a couple of years ago. Again, I like to mess around sometimes by putting my headlamp inside my tent, which makes the tent glow, and I think, again, adds to the drama of the shot. Camping trip in California, with fellow campers. Now, these were people that weren't friends of mine. They just happened to be camping there. I told them what I was trying to do, and I asked them to pose for me, which meant standing still for up to 20, 25 seconds. They were happy to try it, and I got this shot, sent them a copy, and they were thrilled to have a memento of their camping trip like this. I wanted the campfires, but I had no idea that the campfires would light up that scrub pine tree the way it did. I think this shot is wonderful. This was a shot at Great Basin National Park in Nevada a couple of years ago. Again, me triggering the camera by remote control while I'm standing there in the shot, shining my flashlight ahead of me so you can see my silhouette. And look how dark those skies are, all the way down into the trees. No artificial light at all. This was a 25-second exposure. A different location in California, that's the moon on the right-hand side, the crescent moon setting. There's actually a forest fire burning ahead of me that I didn't know about, but its glow shows up with the camera. And again, a beautiful sky spread with stars. Closer to home, this was Pope Farm Park this past summer, July of 2020, with the comet Neowise hanging there in the sky. Many of you may have heard about this comet or seen pictures of it on social media. Again, a 15 to 20-second exposure. And finally, I'll leave you with this. You can take pictures of the moon, provided you don't need to magnify it that much. This was back in, I think it was 2005. The moon was nicely lined up with 2 planets and a star, and I even positioned myself so everything kind of lined up with the Capitol. Snapped this picture from a friend's backyard in Monona. You can do this. This is the kind of astrophotography that you don't need special equipment for. Get out there, give it a try. Thank you.